1 in 6 marriages in the United States now crosses racial or ethnic lines, and the couples navigating that reality have done it without a clinical roadmap. Dr. Geoffrey Greif and Victoria Stubbs, LCSW, co-authors of Interracial Marriage, How Diverse Couples Navigate Relationships, are clinicians, researchers, and authors with decades between them of practice who share with us what hundreds of intermarried couples taught them about love, differences, and what it takes to build a life together. Welcome, Victoria and Jeff, to the Self Careapist Therapist.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
I just want to start off by asking, what is some of the most surprising research that you found while preparing for this book?
I think for me, the most surprising was how, depending on where you are in the country, your experience as an interracial couple can be different. And I think that for me, thinking about, particularly during the period of time when we were really doing in the midst of the research, there was a lot going on, right? 2020 to 2025. And we can easily get caught in our own little bubbles and sort of see how people move around us. But when I heard how people were experiencing things in the Midwest, in the South, as couples, and how they were moving through the world, and the violence that would happen towards them, the violence part was the part that was actually most surprising to me.
I think for me, as a researcher also, when you survey somebody, you get a fairly standard answer of things are going really well, thank you for asking. But when you sit down with people, you take a deep breath and you begin to ask them a little bit more. Yes, things are going well, but it's because they've often had to avoid situations or choose a different path than a couple that's the same race might not have to choose, might not have to avoid. So there's also, from a research perspective, and it certainly applies clinically, you can give somebody a form to fill out and they might say one thing, but when you sit down with them and begin to ask them, other stuff comes out and you find out that their lives are much more complicated than we sometimes know just from looking at research data where a survey is completed. And our book goes into over 150 interviews, and we also use the survey data. So we really try and do a mixed methods approach. And I think that's how we really got some very interesting stories and also some very interesting trends that I'm sure we'll get to.
Yeah, I want to get into more about those research methods too. I like to get into the weeds. Will you take me back to how this collaboration began and how the two of you came together?
Yeah, I approached Victoria after talking at some length with my co-author on two previous books. Michael Woolley and I had written a book on adult siblings and on in-laws, and when it came to looking at interracial marriages, we knew we had to get another perspective. And we knew that Victoria was a fantastic clinician. Michael is also a fantastic clinician. He currently is ill and could not be here for this meeting, for this podcast. But it was a matter of who do we want to bring a different view. I'm obviously a white man, and Michael is also, and getting a perspective from somebody else, particularly a Black woman, was important to us. And we knew her from around the University of Maryland School of Social Work, where she was a beloved teacher and had done a lot on diversity and teaching the faculty how to teach better and how to consider thoughts. So she was a very obvious and easy choice for us. And she and I had talked before too, so we knew each other.
Yeah. And I would just add that, yes, Jeff's also been a mentor of mine. And so I was extremely honored to get the call to ask to participate on it. So it was a privilege.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And Jeff, you're a professor emeritus at the University of Maryland, and Victoria, you were a former full-time faculty there.
Yes.
What else have the two of you been doing? Just a little intro from both of you to this point.
Yes. So in addition, when I was teaching full-time, I had a part-time therapy practice. And then I taught for several years and then left teaching in 2021 and went into my practice full-time, which is inner truth psychotherapy and wellness. So now I'm a full-time therapist and just getting back into doing some teaching on the side, but primarily therapy, coaching, and writing.
I think for me, it's been very important. For the last few years, up till a year or two ago, have been doing a lot of work in the community. I ran a fathering group in the local federal prison, and that was very helpful to me because I needed to keep up to date on what was happening outside the ivory tower so I could bring that information back into the classroom and have a pretty good understanding as much as possible as to what our students, the MSW students, were experiencing out in the field. So that was a really important thing. And I have a very small private practice to essentially one client at this point.
Yeah, all of that resonates with me too. I think some of those teaching aspects are what's so important for me in hosting the podcast. And I'm also faculty with Arizona State University in the School of Social Work, and I have a private practice too. So these are the voices I love to feature because I just think the combination of both things is so important in this field.
It really is.
Can I ask, Jeff, with all of the research on relationships that you've done throughout your time, what made interracial couples a distinct area of research that you saw a need to explore?
I've always been interested in issues around race as well as issues in the family. I had written 2 books with people at UMBC, University of Maryland, Baltimore County, on academically successful African-American men and academically successful African-American women. And I was thinking about what our country is facing too. So it became a topic that I developed from thinking about in-laws and siblings, and both of those underpin some of what we are looking at specifically in the book, because there's a lot of learning about other people when your spouse or your parent in a second marriage or your child as an adult decides to marry your partner with somebody of a different race. That brings in someone different to the family, and I've always been interested in how families figure these things out. By chance, my daughter, my daughter's white, and she married an Egyptian man who, according to the Census Bureau, was considered white, and it still is. But the Census Bureau is now thinking of calling Middle Eastern and North Africans a different race. So here I was doing research on interracial marriage, and all of a sudden my daughter, married to the same man, ends up potentially in an interracial marriage, which goes back to a broader question of what is race. And this is how race can often be viewed by many as a social construct. Here she was in a monoracial marriage and single race children, and now in theory she could have mixed race children, and I could have mixed race grandchildren. So all these things come together. The other one point to make is that, and this comes up in some of the books, I'm also interested in ambivalence and ambiguity. And there's a lot of learning that couples need to do about each other when they come from different religions, different genders, same genders, races, cultures, ethnicity, that involves people having to deal with long-held beliefs about themselves and others. And this is where ambivalence comes in. Maybe I could love my son-in-law, but also have mixed feelings because I may be harboring stereotypes or racist thoughts about somebody from his group. And so having to figure out, and this is true of siblings too, what do you do with your sibling when they marry a jerk? And you have to allow them into the family. That's where ambivalence also comes in. So it's a lot of things that kind of intersected under the heading of, and I know Victoria feels very strongly about this too, what is happening in our country? And is there something we can do to try and push the conversation into maybe a more helpful direction where people learn to listen to each other? And that's where these couples have managed to be really guideposts for us. They've struggled with listening and they're trying to understand each other. And I think that's a model for us all, myself especially.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the findings regarding listening and conflict resolution that you've maybe found that these couples are doing very well?
Let me take that one. What we found is that the couples many of them were forced to start talking in ways that they hadn't talked before. Because race in particular, though it had been a part of their family, because of the time in which we were doing the research, several of them talked about how they were forced to address it in a different way because it was in their face in a different way. And they couldn't act like it wasn't there. And so the communication, not so much that they themselves were going to therapy, but they were learning, sort of like what Jeff was saying, they were learning in real time, sort of what do we actually need to talk about? Like what's actually impacting us on a day-to-day basis? How do we actually navigate this when it's hitting really close to home? And one partner may not want to talk about it because they have a history, right? That's traumatic. One person may not want to talk about it. The other person wants to talk about it. How to even navigate, how often are we talking about this, given that we're dealing with it on a day-to-day basis? So those were some of the big challenges that I noticed that came up, was that people had to really reconfigure how they approached communication around race.
There's a sweet spot sometimes that we found, and we talk about it in the book and in one of the articles that we wrote about how much do you talk about something? And this has to do with race in our book and difference in history. But all couples, how much are you going to talk about money and sex and children and grandchildren and in-laws? We're focused on race, and we found there was kind of a sweet spot that, of course, varies from one couple to the next, but there has to be some openness about it, but too much openness we found, and just talking about it all the time can also be very stressful for
Yeah.
couples. But we can't tell anybody how much they need to talk about it, of course, as clinicians, but they have to figure that out. But they're coming at it, as Victoria says, from such different places, and with different needs and different awarenesses. There was a lot of stuff that we found about whites needing to be educated by their non-white partner. And that's very tiring for the non-white partner to say, hey, do you know what's going on here?
Yeah.
And that became an issue. How much of the education has to go on? And a lot of the white people wanted to talk about it all of a sudden with their, one example, mixed race son. And the son said, where have you been the last 10 years?
Yeah.
This has been going on. And now, because of George Floyd, all of a sudden you want to go to protests and do this and that. So that's where openness around these issues of race becomes so important, and hopefully can be a model for us all to figure out, how do we read this? How do we talk about it and move the conversation someplace to a healthier position?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it feels like I'm hearing that the white partner in couples will think they're opening a door that allows these conversations to happen. And there's still a need for autonomy in terms of how open the other partner wants that door to be, or how much instruction still feels it can feel traumatic, perhaps, to be constantly invited into a conversation that could be flooding to the system of the other individual.
Yeah, 100%. 100%. And that's exactly what we heard.
Is there, did you hear any strategies for how this is managed, or any alternatives to asking the partner for education? Like, was it helpful to seek out their own education that didn't come from the partner, or to have, stop symbols when it became too much? Were there anything that you pulled from your conversations that could be helpful here?
Victoria, do you want to answer that, or should I?
Why don't you start? Because I may have more clinical where you may have some of the data.
Okay, so I think one of the things to be clear, I want to make sure people know that we're not only talking about black-white marriage. So black-white marriage in the United States has gotten much more attention, much more heat, much more stuff coming at them than anybody else in an intermarriage. We have people who are Asian American, Latin American, marrying whites, marrying people that are not white. So there's every intermarriage that we have, and of course the attention that these other groups get, depending upon the environment, may not be the same as black-white marriage. So that's just, I think, an important point to talk about. So sometimes we have two minoritized people that are married, and they kind of join together against the oppressor, white people. There was a little bit of that, which is totally understandable. We had one quote of a guy said, when our parents get together, they're really on the same page. They understand what it's like, but that can vary so much. So there's no monolithic white person, black person, certainly no monolithic Latin or Asian Americans. We had Native American, First Nations people. But it's important to point out, for example, with Asian Americans, are you talking about someone who just arrived in the United States last week and married somebody, or someone who has been here longer than anybody else that they married? They've been here 3 and 4 generations and are more Americanized than, say, somebody from Sweden who just got off the boat. So there are all these different ways to think about how these folks have to navigate what they are bringing into the room. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Victoria.
Yeah, I was just, because that sort of connects sort of to what I was saying at the beginning about where people live. So when we talk about sort of strategies, some of it was also contingent upon where they lived, right? So like if they lived in an area that was more diverse, even just how they move around, so the comfortability around talking about things might be different. If they live in a more rural area, or if they're going somewhere, like talking about literally the strategy is we have to strategize, right? So like that then becomes a strategy, is that like when we go certain places, we have a conversation beforehand about how we're going to navigate said place. Like that then becomes a strategy, right? Which is why when we were talking about the 2020 era, for a lot of folks, it was overwhelming and they didn't have a strategy for talking about all of the trauma that was happening and what was in your face. Whereas for those couples who were navigating the world, who did have a strategy around this, the strategy is to strategize, right? It was a little different.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That knowing there's an opportunity to strategize and welcoming that into the conversation can in itself be the strategy. And it leaves room to have the strategy be always adapting.
Right. And recognizing that having a strategy conversation opens the door for the white person, for example, who may not even be thinking about having a strategy. Now they're like, oh, wait, I'm now aware. We talk a lot about perspective taking. I'm now aware that my partner needs to wants us to feel safe, either wants me to feel safe, wants us to feel safe. So we have to have a strategy. That may not have been their perspective prior to that opportunity. Now their awareness has shifted. And so when we talk about educating folks, sometimes it can be done in real time and it doesn't feel like a burden, whereas other times it can feel overwhelming when it's a constant sort of, looking to them for what to do or constantly trying to point out, here's why I'm saying this thing, right? Because I believe I'm thinking of one woman, Black woman that we interviewed who specifically expressed the exhaustion that comes from needing to constantly explain and prepare and do all the things versus at some point, yes, I need for you to do some of this on your own. Because again, the perspective is that as a Black person moving through the world, I need for you to understand that I'm coming into this experience with a different perspective. So if you recognize that that is my perspective, can you now also go and do your own homework on what comes with that, the history, the why, all the things, so I don't have to keep, to your point, re-traumatizing myself by explaining to you why I have this perspective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that feels really important and like an important invitation that once that conversation is out on the table, there can be invitations to do self-study, to read other things, to seek out other information that can be helpful.
Yeah, including talking to other people.
Yeah. Yeah, that
Right, we
seems like
found about a third of our sample, not that that applies to anybody other than the sample, stop going to certain social groups, and they would also purposefully join other social groups where there were more couples that they felt looked like them. And of course, that's true of us all. If I'm married to a white person, maybe I'm going to be seeking out single race groups because of the history of race and the discomfort we have in crossing racial lines. But it becomes more acute when you've got a mixed race, an interracial marriage, because they are trying to balance two different groups, and there are fewer of those mixed marriages than there are of monoracial marriages.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Is that a data point that did you find or did you ask about how many couples had interracial couple friends or contacts?
We got at it more by, are you purposefully moving into a neighborhood where you won't feel like you're the only Black person, white person, fill in the blank person? And we found out that a lot of people did, not the majority, but a lot said they specifically sought out neighborhoods, they sought out racial groups or mixed race groups. They maybe avoided in-law events on either side. They may have avoided coming to their own family. They may have avoided going to their spouse's family event because there was often someone outside of the immediate family who made them feel uncomfortable or seemed to be uncomfortable with them. The further these folks got from their immediate family, the less support they tended to find. In general, majority were very happy in their marriage and thought that intermarriage was a really good thing. So the message we also want to bring is that people are very happy in their intermarriage and are making this work. We just believe they have to work a little harder at it than do people that are more closely aligned in race or ethnicity.
Mm-hmm.
Can you speak to how common those experiences of disapproval were? It sounds like, from what you just said, that it's more common in the extended family, not the immediate family, but how common is it entirely?
Mm-hmm.
Only from our data, and of course, we don't have a representative sample. It was maybe 15 to 20% said they had some really difficult person floating around, either as a friend or as a extended family member, or maybe directly in their family.
Mm-hmm.
So the vast majority are doing well and feel accepted. The book is especially helpful to those that are struggling. And we have a lot of great advice for people that are struggling and can sort of hope to normalize their experiences. They're not the only ones struggling out there. But we think the book has an advantage to everybody because we all struggle, whether we're in a partnership or marriage or not, with understanding each other. And that's where we hope the book can also be helpful.
And if I could add to that point of the struggle, what I thought was actually rather beautiful about it is that a lot of the families who spoke about, everything working and getting along, several of them talked about how they had to get there, though. That, like, a lot of them talked about how in the beginning there was some family member, the grandmother, grandfather, right, even a parent didn't approve, right, and there was tension. And what I thought that was really beautiful was several of the couples talked about, again, the work that went in to moving the needle. And oftentimes it was the parent, when they finally became a grandparent, for example, they were like, well, I have grandchildren. Grandchildren seem to change a lot of people's mindsets because they don't want to miss out, right? And so what we saw was that over time and proximity, because the other part of it too was that for some of the families, again, geography makes a difference. If you don't have Black and brown people around you in a white community, your proximity to the norm of even interracial relationships might be few and far between. So now you have somebody in your family, you now are in closer proximity to the very people that you may have stereotypes about, right? But now you're experiencing them differently. And that starts to then, the more you're around people, the more things aren't as scary as you thought they were. The more you're starting to enjoy the different cultures and flavors and different things. And so several of the couples talked about how things changed over time to where there's no longer tension around it because everyone has now adjusted to, we have multiple flavors in one space.
Yeah, that's such a great point. It reminds me of conversations that maybe we'd have with a supervisee or an intern, because sometimes I think they come in thinking, I don't think I'd work well with this type of client, but because they're taking a whole story or a whole idea, and then they meet the client and it's just a client,
Yeah.
it's just one-to-one. You just work with who's in front of you, but it sounds like kind of, it works the same way in families. Once you leave the big story that you're telling yourself behind and get to know an individual, it's like, oh, I really like, it's just an individual and we have our own relationship.
Yeah, that's a good example. Yeah.
You had mentioned that, I loved this part about grandchildren kind of being the bridge. What are some of the joys and challenges that the research highlighted around raising and getting to know mixed race children?
Some of it was around when kids get to be teenagers, they're bringing up stuff that parents are often not ready to talk about. And so it's important for parents to be able to be aware of this. Now, remember, often mixed race children may not look like either parent, and they may have a racial identity that is different from both parents. And they may have a racial identity that changes. It's not unusual for teens to change their identity as they age. And it's not surprising that if they are associating with one racial group, they may change and associate with a different racial group or a third racial group. So it's also not uncommon for siblings to look different from each other when they have parents of different races. So there are a lot of ways that the children may not identify, the siblings may not identify as each other. And it's not, sorry, something just popped up here. Okay. My apologies on my screen. It's not uncommon for siblings to look different from each other and to look different from parents. When children are young, if you had a darker skinned mother with a lighter skinned child, she may be confused as being a nanny. If you had a darker skinned child with a lighter skinned man, he may be seen as a mentor or a coach taking somebody out. So there are all these tropes that people have about why is that child with that parent. There's a story about a parent who was born in India, married a white man, and her sons don't look alike. One son identified as Asian, and the other son was identified by the school as white. And their mother was very concerned about whether or not this fit what the child felt. So there was a lot of discussions back and forth, and finally they both agreed to ask the son, and the son said, sure, I'm happy to be considered white on that form. So there are all these things that bring up, am I holding on to my culture? Am I holding on to my ancestry if my child is identifying as different from me? And all these things can happen when kids are on their phone and they're meeting with other kids and trying to figure out who they are. And they may often push parents in a very healthy way to try and get with the program of who they are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that is an interesting element of it. That social construct piece is showing up that it was the race was prescribed, it sounds, by the school, and it opened up opportunity to discuss it and give the players a voice.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that right there is kind of standing out to me because it showed how the school could learn about having that conversation rather than just data entering what they saw. And I'm wondering if there are growth edges or opportunities for therapists working with these couples that have stood out to you or that you've been thinking about since beginning this research.
Yes, and it's similar along that line that you were saying. There's a few growth pieces. One, starting off with what you were saying about not assuming, right? Not assuming anyone's identity, which I know, we often talk about when we're, becoming therapists, et cetera, but not to assume, because you don't know how somebody is identified. But that's also why I include the 6 pillars of a brave space framework in the text, specifically for therapists, because it's something that we still, as a profession, we still struggle with how to have these types of conversations in the therapy space, or in general, but also in the therapy space. And so the 6 pillars, I designed that framework initially when I was at the university to help faculty and students, but to specifically help faculty create an environment where folks could have these types of conversations, where we could really get into power, privilege, oppression, race, because everyone's sort of tiptoeing and not really sure, et cetera, et cetera. And so the 6 pillars of a brave space can help therapists. We've taken it from the classroom into the community and now into the therapy office with things to consider because, where it starts, one of the pillars, really one of the first pillars is vulnerability, right? It requires vulnerability to have these types of conversations. And that means even the therapist, because oftentimes, depending on how you were trained, right, you may be thinking that you should know everything. And you might be thinking that you should not be uncomfortable when that's just, we're human, right? And so the vulnerability is also being able to ask some of these questions, right? Can you help me understand, how you identify? Because I don't want to assume. That's vulnerable in and of itself, right? Because to your point of the stories, that we may have a story in our own mind about how the client is going to see us if I say this thing or do this thing. But we want to create a space where we can have these types of conversations and recognize that we're human. I may be an expert in something, but I'm a human. And so I may have some nervousness. I may have some fear. I may be exhausted, like we were talking about before, right? And so being able to share and self-disclose about that, both as a therapist, welcomes the client then to say, oh, okay, it's okay for me to ask certain questions, or it's okay for me to talk about certain things when the therapist leads and creates the space for people to do that. So that's just one example of how the 6 pillars can be used to help with smoothing out some of these edges.
Mm-hmm. Would you feel comfortable sharing more of the pillars?
Sure. Yeah. So there's vulnerability, which I just spoke about. Leaning into fear is another pillar, because a lot of times we won't say things because we're afraid or embarrassed. I was just in a case consult where that came up with with an interracial couple, actually,
Mm.
where the white person, the man, was married to a Middle Eastern woman and expressed being embarrassed when asked if they knew how the partner felt about what was going on in the Middle East, et cetera, et cetera. So, right, like that's an example of embarrassment, but maybe a bit of fear too. Like, I don't want to say a thing. I don't want to go. I don't know what the person's going to say. I don't know how they're going to respond. But particularly in therapy, we got to bring it up because it's already there. And that's the piece that therapists have to remember, that this stuff is already in the room.
Mm-hmm.
And so lean into the fear and ask the questions. We also have examining intentions, right? And so when you say a thing, know why you're saying a thing. What's your intention? What's your intention behind? A lot of times we want to just talk for the sake of talking. And it's like, why are we saying a thing? Right? Why are we asking a question? Is it because we're genuinely curious, right? Or is it because we just want to debate, right? Or is it because we're trying to be right? Like we need to examine where are we coming from with this question, with this line of questioning, with this, if I'm giving a soliloquy, like what's going on, right? And so examining intentions, critical thinking, right, which comes in to being open to, we talk a lot about perspective taking, which is another pillar. So listening to someone's perspective is, we've been saying it over and over again, right? Like we have to, how do we understand? I may not even fully, maybe even agree, but I need to understand where you're coming from. How did you see it that way? How did you get there to that point? Can I just take that in, right? And then critically think about how you got there, right? Critically think about why you might think that way. Critically think about why hold a certain position. So the critical thinking part is key. If we all know that we have to do that, if we can have these types of conversations. And then lastly, we have mindfulness, right? Which is, can we slow down, know when we're getting activated? We might be triggered by something someone said, but can we slow down, do the first 5, right? So that we can understand, like, okay, I can be present to this conversation and I'm not bringing in old stuff, making it about something else. But let me pay attention to how I'm feeling in my body, because I might very well be activated. And now I'm just responding from that activated place. And I've lost the ability to be critical, to think critically, and I may very well be coming from a place of fear and defensiveness, et cetera. Let me slow down. And then if we go back to the vulnerability, I can share, in this moment, I'm feeling really nervous because I think if I say this thing, it's going to sound like whatever, right? Now we're using the pillars. The mindfulness reminds us to, like, let me breathe, slow down, be vulnerable, examine my intentions, think critically. Let me understand their perspective, right? Let me lean into this fear I have by maybe even communicating that, oh, this is making me nervous. Boom, now we're human. So that's how the pillars work.
Oh, that was a great description, and
Thank you.
something I was kind of noticing is that some of the language that you were using, vulnerability, fear, those can be words that have a negative connotation to people and thus are avoided. So it seemed powerful to have them built in as things not to be avoided and not even to be regarded as negative.
Right. And that's really how it came about, because what I was experiencing in the classroom was those words were negative, which was stopping the conversation. So now we're not moving, right? And so if we can recognize the humanness in everybody, whether I'm a professor, whether I'm a therapist, whether I'm a student, whether I'm a client, I'm a human. So I'm going to be experiencing stuff in real time. And the Brave Spaces framework was really designed to point that out first and say, like, if we can recognize that we're all experiencing something, can that level the playing field enough so that we can really start to have a conversation?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We've talked a lot about we've talked a lot about the challenges that come up in these couples, but even in the opening statement, Jeff mentioned that what you were seeing in the research was a lot of satisfaction in the couples. Can you speak to that?
Sure. I think that people revel in the fact that they are the wave of the future. A lot of them said, we're looking like this is how society is going to look, and we are raising children that are going to be more open to other people. And just as we've been more open to other people, and this is what's going to happen, we're preparing the way for others. So a lot of them were proud of themselves and proud of what they represent in terms of the trend. Obviously, 60 years ago, almost 59 years ago, when the Supreme Court made the loving decision, only 1 in 33 couples in the United States were interracial. Now they're 1 in 10, and 1 in 6 newlyweds are interracial or interethnic. So I think a lot of these folks feel that they're on the wave of something. A lot of them don't even think about it. If they live in a very diverse city like a Washington, D.C., or if they've always lived around other people, a lot of our folks grew up in diverse neighborhoods, went to high school with kids who were racially and ethnically different from themselves, had prior boyfriends or girlfriends that were different, and this is just sort of something that they're doing. So it's not like every couple is feeling like they're on the edge of something, but they do have to make some accommodations. They are aware when they go out of their area that they may have to think a little bit more. Even here in Maryland, Baltimore is very diverse, but we have couples that don't want to go to the Eastern Shore of Maryland, which has historically been a very racist part of part of the state. And they are thinking, we have to be careful here. Some couples on the Eastern Shore, for example, are careful who they send into a store to buy something. I mean, all these things are in the back of their mind. They've made accommodations. They're doing well. Their kids are doing well, but they may be specifically avoiding travel or certain groups. And I think we keep on coming back to having to educate everybody about the fact that, yes, these couples are doing great and they are a triumph, but they've sometimes, not always, had to make accommodations, and race may elevate itself in some areas that they travel to. We did find, by the way, that if you have a language struggle with your in-laws, in other words, if I married somebody who was born in another country, for example, that would be more of a struggle in a family. So there's also this notion of language and culture that we have to be aware of too, that if I can't communicate with my in-laws because they were born in Asia and are not fluent in English, and I'm not fluent in Korean or Chinese or Japanese, that's going to cause my husband or my wife to have to navigate in between myself and his or her or their parents. So there are all these other things that come into the broader scope of international marriages, which are, often interracial marriages, not always, of course.
Yeah, that's a great point. Does it seem like there's ends up being less integration for that person who isn't able to then communicate with their in-laws? Like they don't feel like they can begin to identify with that culture as much as a person who can communicate with the in-laws could?
Victoria,
No,
should
go
I
ahead.
answer that or?
Yeah.
Yes, it is an issue because let's say I've married a woman who is the product of two parents that only speak Spanish, and I'm not fluent in Spanish, and there's a crisis with my wife or my husband, and I have to speak to their parents, and I'm having trouble communicating. So there's already these issues, and then do we teach our children, if we have children, to speak both languages? Are they going to adopt the language of my family or of my spouse's family? So all these things become one more act of negotiation, and the history of when that family has come to the United States, if they've ever come to the United States, or whether or not I've married a person who I met overseas. We have number of people who go overseas, meet somebody, for example, in the Peace Corps. We have an example of a white woman who married a man from India and brought him back to the United States. And they met in, I think, cool weather. And when they came back to the United States, it was cool. And then it became summer and she put on shorts. And from his cultural perspective, that was a shock. And he didn't feel comfortable with her going out in shorts because he had not been raised in that culture. So you have a cultural clash, and they had to talk it out. And then she also had to educate him about the fact, you're a dark-skinned man here. You may encounter stuff that you've not encountered in your home country. He was going like, what are you talking about? So she had to educate him to be more wary than maybe he would normally have been. So there are all these intercultural things, including language and communication, that can cause couples to have to really work hard to communicate.
Yeah. That reminded me, did your research pick up on themes regarding whether it was the male or the female in the relationship that was of a particular race?
We weren't able to analyze the data specifically. I mean, we of course know the gender, but you're raising the whole important question of intersectionality. So if I am a Black man and I'm married to a white woman, and our roles are the same in the household, when we go out on the street and we need to hail a taxi, I may have her hail the taxi. There are those sorts of adjustments that often involve power inside the home and power out in the street. Who is more likely to have power outside of the home? And unfortunately, in the United States, it's often the white person. And that's the way our society has been historically and currently is constructed, maybe even more so. So now, if you are a white man, you have, in most environments in the United States, much more power. And people that are aligned with you have to be aware of that. And as a white man, you have to be aware of that. Yet, what happens to that power imbalance when you get back in the home and things have to be worked through and shared? And that's where, again, everybody is different and we can't sort of group everybody together. So sort of writ large, these are issues that couples may come across, and they are going to have a language, a shared language about how to talk about those things with themselves and with their parents and with their children.
Yeah, that dynamic is really important and interesting, I think, that you just mentioned. A little bit ago, you mentioned the loving decision, and because I know that you've brought it to my attention that Loving Day is June 12th of 2026. Can you give a little bit more background and information on that loving decision?
Well, the Lovings got married in Washington, D.C. in the late 1950s. They were both from Virginia, and then they wanted to move back to Virginia and were arrested when they came into the state. And so they were allowed to leave the state. And then a few years later, they began to want to change the law in Virginia, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And in 1967, on June 12th, the Supreme Court made it legal to be intermarried anywhere in the country. At the time of the Supreme Court decision, about, I think, a third of the states, maybe 16 or 17 states, forbade interracial marriage. And with that, we celebrate every year now. Now we're up to the 59th year of this decision, and it was a family name Loving, of course, and that's why it's conveniently called National Loving Day. I'm glad they didn't have name a Smith. It would be National Smith Day. What would that be like?
Exactly. It's too perfect.
Yeah.
And very timely with the May release of your book that date will be coming up shortly. I've been waiting to ask this question so we can geek out about this, but can you tell me how the data was gathered and some of your research methods? How did you find the couples that participated in the research for this book?
No, I think that's a really important question. I was running a series of research classes with MSW students, and for the previous books, I had done the same thing. So as part of the assignment, students in my class would have to find 5 or 6 people, in this case, in an interracial marriage to interview. Now, one of the advantages of this is that if you advertise and say, I want to interview people that are in an interracial marriage, you may get an even more selected group. So these were sort of people that they knew and had not overly or not identified as an interracial marriage, but the students said, are you in an interracial marriage? Their friends, some of them put up requests on local neighborhood listservs. And they would do then in-depth interviews, and we have 150 or so interviews. Victoria and Michael and I did a number of interviews too with people that we had gathered from research. So that formed one basis of the stories, and we have many, many stories that we follow throughout the book. We have people who we quote in various chapters, and we see what happens to them along the way. We also did in 2022, in December, a Qualtrics survey, which is a national survey. And we have a sample there of over 430 people. And we were able to run, Michael especially, able to run some quantitative analyses to see what are some of the trends in the data. So we would find the trends in the survey data and then look for examples of those trends to bring forth in the in-depth interviews that we did.
Okay, really interesting stuff. Were people pretty open to participating, did you find?
Yeah.
Yes. We did find, as far as we know,
Yeah.
as far as our students said, that they went to ask people. I mean, obviously some people were, some people weren't. When you interview people that you get, there are pluses and minuses from a research perspective. We published 8 or 10 articles in journals, psychology and social work journals. So it's met a level of scientific merit. And some of the pluses and minuses of interviewing people that is they may hide things from you, but they also know that you know them, and so they may not hide things from you. So I think it really depends. And when you're doing qualitative research, everybody has a different story. But after a while, the data start to get saturated, points start to get repeated across. What we had the interesting experience of, we're interviewing, whites married to blacks, Asian married to blacks, Asian married to whites, Latins married to blacks, to whites, and so on. Men and women, old, young, straight, lesbian, gay, every possible group, some with children, most with children, but not everybody with children. So all these different stories came up. And again, there's no single interracial, couple is the theme we keep on coming back to. but their experiences in a racist society might begin to look very similar, especially at the time that we are living in now and have been living in since the death of George Floyd and before. COVID, a lot of anti-Asian American stuff, and everything about the border, people coming across the
ICE,
border,
yeah.
and how that was politicized for years, not just in 2024, but in 2020, it was politicized. So we were doing research at a really crucial time in America between COVID, Black Lives Matter, and all the crisis around the border, or made into a crisis by what was happening from a political point of view. And you in Arizona,
Yeah.
know that very well. We're a little bit farther away geographically, but we still experience the pain and suffering in Maryland too.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's a great point. That one is top of mind for us here
Mhm.
often.
Mhm.
Oh, that is such an interesting way, just rewinding a bit, to do research and to be having students having those conversations. I can see a lot of value in that in it from a lot of different ways. You get interesting research, they get some really interesting, probably experiences with a little bit of motivational interviewing, but just touching base with folks who they maybe hadn't even seen in that way or thought of in that way, and got to hear a little bit about experiences that they.
It was also important for us to comment that part of our thinking about what we found was, of course, generated by the students. So it's not
Yeah.
just Victoria and Jeff and Michael analyzing data. These are students that had gotten into it and came to class and talked about it. And that's a wide range of MSW and PhD students. Some of the articles we wrote on Asian Americans, I co-authored with some PhD students who were from Korea and China, and they were looking at the data too. So we have a lot of different people, a lot of different backgrounds looking at the data, talking to us about it and say, I think it's this or that, which is wholly different maybe from the way I personally was thinking about it. But they're coming in with, 2020, 2022, 2024, 2025 versions of things, and understanding that we all have to be open to and make sure that we incorporate that voice into the book.
Yeah, that is so cool. I think I missed this, but did you say they were students in your classes? Or not research assistants? That was an assignment they had for a class.
Yes, they signed up at the University of Maryland School of Social Work to take their advanced research course, and one of their options was to sign up for a class where they would go out and interview people.
Oh, how cool. Wow. I love to hear that. That's so interesting. All right. As we start to wind down, is there anything that we haven't touched on yet that feels important to mention?
I think the only thing that I would just highlight again is sort of how the couples that we interviewed really are forming a blueprint. And the takeaway that we got from the interviews is that, like, this really can be a blueprint for how to navigate interpersonal relationships from diverse cultural, ethnic, racial backgrounds. And one of the interviews that really stands out, and we sort of closed the book out with this, is a father-in-law, who, again, had struggled at the beginning. But what it really boiled down to for him was his love for his family. And at the end of the day, he was like, I love my kids. And so I'm going to do what I need to do to make sure that everybody is comfortable and feels safe in this family. And I think that's really the crux of what we want readers to get from this.
Yeah, that feels so important.
Because it can be easy to just focus on, because things can feel really heavy and dark, and they are. And at the same time, there's still a lot of love and there's still a lot of work that is being done that can continue to be done. And when we really do, as corny as people may think that it sounds, when we really do lead with love and curiosity, it changes our connections with one another.
I second everything she said.
All right. Well, Victoria and Jeff, thank you so much for taking the time with us today to share about your new book and how it came about and some of the great elements that we can pull from it for our clients.
I have a copy I can show you.
Show us.
I just happened to bring this.
Yes.
Okay. There it is. We'll get it linked in the show notes. And I think that it's going to be it's just a great eye-opening book. It sounds like one of a kind in some ways too.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having us. Your questions were great, really helpful conversation, I think, for me and for us. And I'm glad you're doing this.
Thank you. So nice to meet you both.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.